So, today on the podcast, we're continuing our story of Disney legend Mary Blair. We're picking up exactly where we left off last time, with Mary returning to Disney after a decades-long absence, when Walt invited her to design the doll figures for the Children of the World ride that he was making for the New York World's Fair. A ride that later absorbed a much more famous name, It's a Small World. If the late 1940s and 1950s comprised the high point of Mary's work with animated features, the mid-1960s up through the early 1970s would be another high point in her career when she worked with WED on attraction design and art installations for the Fair, Disneyland, and Disney World. And so with that, if you're ready, let's jump back into our story to the intricacies of how Small World was developed and also the trouble that was then moving around inside of Mary's personal life. Disney's original plan for the Children of the World attraction was to have Mary Blair create character designs for children's figures, a job she could have accomplished mostly or even exclusively from her home in Great Neck, New York. But as the project evolved, she found herself taking over the role of art director, which meant that she would now oversee visual arrangement of the ride itself, an assignment that included many show stages. This also meant that after a decades-long break, she would again spend many weeks, if not months, at the Disney studio in Burbank and a new WED compound in Glendale. Around the studio, Mary's name still garnered respect, largely for her artistic contributions to Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, and Peter Pan. For middle-aged Disney artist, Mary was primarily viewed as a talented colleague, also as a friend. For a few, she was viewed as a threat, as Walt had a habit of deferring to her artistic sense, particularly in regards to color. But for younger artists, Mary was viewed as a local legend, an artist whose name was still mentioned at meetings and whispered in the halls of the animation building, even though she had been gone for years. Among those most captivated by Mary's work was WED designer Rolly Crump, who was another artist assigned to the Children of the World project. Once Mary was elevated from the role of character design to art director, Crump started to count down the days until she showed up in California. "I remember that day," Rolly said. "I was sitting in a building over here on top of a stepladder and she walked in. I remembered her from all the films. I thought, oh my God, I'm going to meet Mary Blair. Almost as exciting as when I met Walt Disney." Another admirer assigned to this ride was Alice Davis, the woman who, while on her honeymoon 7 years earlier, had met Mary and Lee in New York. Walt, almost surely sensing a design kinship between these two women, put Alice on the project to design the international costumes. "I got a call from Walt's secretary out of the blue," Alice recalled. "Not only did I get to work with Mark, I got to work with Mary Blair, who was one of my idols." Though art director for an amusement attraction was a new role for Mary, Walt ensured that she was surrounded and protected by admirers and friends, from Raleigh to Alice, also Mark Davis, who would develop the movement animation and contribute to the staging of the dolls. Through the selection of project colleagues, Walt also appears to have been aware of these pockets where Mary's name and reputation inspired jealousy, even among a few friends. One of these individuals was artist John Hench. Hench liked and socialized with Mary, but at times was threatened by her. After she quit Disney in 1953, he had become one of the key colorists at the studio and the key colorist at WED. He tried to manage these jealousies, but at times they came out. As Alice Davis recalled, "You could see John Hench's feathers rustle every time Walt would turn his back to him and listen to Mary." By this point in her life, 17 years after moving east, Mary looked like a successful woman from New York. She tended to dress in knee-length skirts, often with matching hats. Her hair now was cut at her shoulders. She wore minimal jewelry, though she would wear a pearl choker or necklaces made from polished beads. She always had at least one pair, if not multiple pairs, of eyeglasses with her, as she was becoming nearsighted after decades of staring at paper and canvas arranged directly in front of her. Though some work had already begun on the attraction layout, Mary began to revise designs so the entire ride would reflect her sensibilities, like one of her family-focused ads come to life. In the world of fine art, a canvas primarily reflected the vision and style of a single artist. This was not always true in the world of theme park amusements. The Enchanted Tiki Room, recently opened at Disneyland, reflected the artistic sensibilities of many artists, from those who loved tiki culture to those who admired vaudeville and opera. But the Children of the World attraction would function more like a fine arts offering, in that the final visual presentation would primarily represent the vision and style of Mary. Once in California, she began to sketch out ideas for various stages. Sketches that expanded with collage elements and a focus on basic geometric shapes. One reporter would later describe her early design process for this ride. "Starting with a sketch and a few snips of paper," the reporter explained, "Mary quickly bodies forth a range of mountains, the Tower of Pisa, and a tropical rainforest." In terms of her methods, she often rolled out lengths of butcher's paper, creating art that was far larger than typical designs for other Disney attractions. She worked up close, focusing on her lines. Her friend Alice Davis recalled that Mary at times carried a purse full of glasses. You never saw so many pairs of glasses, and she wore contact lenses. And then once she was doing some things that was very fine and difficult, she would maybe have 2 or 3 pairs of glasses. Like others at the studio, Mary appears to have been aware of the political elements arranged into this attraction. It was not just a general call for peace and understanding. It was a specific call that was being made against the cultural unrest of the mid-1960s. In 1963, protests exploded across America to demand racial justice and job equality for all citizens. On October 28th, while Mary was designing this attraction, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington, D.C. This speech called for the end of racism, segregation, and discrimination in America, and urged government bodies to live up to the country's ideals that all people are created equal. Even a casual observer of American culture would notice that Walt's boat ride was, in part, a response to cultural problems bubbling up across the country. From the perspective of cultural dialogue, the brilliance of Mary's character designs was largely focused in 2 areas. She was able to suggest similarities in children throughout the world, from a range of regional, racial, and ethnic backgrounds, by reusing character proportions for each moving doll figure. She was also able to suggest similarities in world architecture by relying heavily on simple geometric or organic shapes, in particular the circle, the triangle, the square, and the rectangle. The buildings themselves, such as the Eiffel Tower and the Taj Mahal, irregular in scale, were often skewed or slightly lopsided, as if these elements too had been cleverly constructed by children. In this way, her early designs reinforced the basic theme of the attraction, that children from diverse racial and cultural backgrounds shared not only similar environments, but also similar goals, desires, and longings, visually signified through the similarity of their body and facial shapes. By extension, the visual rhetoric of her design suggested that children across the globe shared a similar set of dreams. But tucked into this ride was a softer and more poignant message aimed at America, that diverse people within this country shared the same goals of happiness, safety, and connectedness. This message certainly couldn't be lost on those in Washington, D.C. or New York, which were the two primary East Coast audience groups for the fair, also the primary locations where racial tensions and protests moved through American cities. Cultural politics and an appeal for understanding, however, were only one element that Mary considered while designing the ride. After central visual motifs were established, Mary considered how the ride might expand as a journey through color. Each room and set of stages wouldn't only represent a region or a set of cultures, it would also present a new experience with color. We tried to give each area a different feeling by changing the color scheme, Mary explained. The European setting is a mixture of bright gay tints, the Asian has casts of yellow and brown, the African focuses on the night hours with greens and blues, and we used very hot colors to bring out the Mexico motif. Another of her fellow artists, Joyce Carlson, recalled that Mary used unconventional means to arrive at the exact colors for each stage area. She used theatrical gels, Carlson explained. She cut them up and put them on top of her artwork. The unique color palette with gels creating highly saturated tones created its own set of problems, as these exact colors couldn't be purchased from the usual paint suppliers. I had to go and get some of the paints from the ink and paint department, Carlson added, and mix them in with our paint. That is, Disney needed to invent procedures to develop usable paint that would exactly express the colors Mary wanted to use in the ride and also be durable enough for a water-centered attraction. Many fellow artists marveled at how well Mary could combine colors to create a unique experience inside of this ride. As this was a unique talent, an area in which Mary's abilities were far above most everyone else at the studio, her aptitude also produced some good-natured kidding. Her friend Alice Davis joked that it was her arrangement of eyeglasses that allowed her to see colors so clearly. "That's why you're such a good artist," Alice said to Mary. "You can see the colors. We have to stand back and squint our eyes to see if it blends or it stands out as such." Roly Crump joked that her nearsightedness perhaps contributed to her unique designs. "That was the reason the colors were strong and the shapes were good and bold," Roly kidded, "because of her bad eyesight." Now in California, Mary moved back into her old social groups, with Mark Davis, Hazel George, and to some extent Ward Kimball and John Hench. She made new friends at WED, particularly Harriet Burns, another female artist who had found a professional home at Disney. One of her most significant connections, however, remained with Walt. In meetings, Walt told Mary about his plans for Disneyland and for films he wanted to make. Mary Poppins was then in production at the studio. The animation department was also adapting Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book stories for the screen. Then Walt explained one of his largest plans, that he wanted to develop the art school that had educated both Mary and Lee into a much larger multidiscipline institute which would focus not only on the visual arts but also music and dance. "I would have lunch with Walt," Mary explained, "and he would talk about the school." At this point, the proposed school even had a name, California Institute of the Arts, or CalArts for short. It would focus on both the fine arts and arts fields that prepared people for studio assignments. Walt told her that it will open soon. But her friendship with Walt wasn't only based on Walt's projects and his interests. Even though Mary had been away for years, Walt still understood the inner workings of Mary's personal life, particularly the importance of family. At times, Walt would fly Mary on the company plane up to see her mother and sisters. Officially, these weekend trips were to take Disney film to a processing lab in Northern California, but unofficially, these trips were arranged around Mary's schedule, with a stop at the San Jose airport. At times, Hazel George went with her. Mary tended to stay with her older sister Margaret, who lived in Campbell, California, not far from where they had grown up. Her niece recalled, "My dad liked to play poker, and so did Mary. So my mom would make a meal or soup or sandwiches, and they would play poker, not for any big stakes or anything." While up north, Mary tried to decompress and let some of the stress from work fall away. She spent time in the local foothills. One of her favorite things to do with her sisters was to climb the mountains at Hecker Pass near Morgan Hill. More than once that fall, Mary went back to New York to check in on Lee and the boys, but after a week or two, she typically returned to California. "Walt was willing to go along with all my commuting expense," Mary explained. "I would go out to Glendale about 7 or 8 times a year, do work I had to do there, then take the rest of the work home." If it was a short trip to California, she might stay with Mark and Alice Davis, but more often, Disney booked her into the Tolucan, a hotel just down the street from the studio. With this, Mary was once again living out of suitcases and spending entire days flying from coast to coast. But the comforts provided by the studio allowed her to focus more deeply on her assignment. Work on the attraction was demanding and endless, complete show sets that needed to be built by the end of the year with props, lighting, and hundreds of finished figures. Mary understood that the finished attraction needed visual unity that presented one artist's aesthetics. In this case, that person was her, Mary, so she needed to supervise each aspect of production. She set all the colors for the costumes, Alice Davis recalled. "I did the research and made the pencil sketches. We would discuss the colors, and I would take fabric swatches or colored paper and staple them to copies of the sketches." Along with trips to see her mother and sisters, Mary also found a deeper connection with her niece Maggie, a freshman at UCLA. On weekends, Maggie visited her, typically at the Tolucan. They sat on chaise lounge chairs by the pool and read books and wrote letters. Though Maggie was only 18, Mary taught her how to mix drinks for adults. I would make Mary an orange juice and vodka, and I would have a Coke. We'd have a wonderful time, and she'd take me to dinner at Sorrentino's Italian restaurant in Toluca Lake, which was walking distance. And then early Monday morning, Mary was back at work at Disney developing the ride. While Mary and her colleagues developed stage areas for the attraction, Walt worked on a different problem. Though many structures at the World's Fair had been designed by internationally renowned architects and were already being built on site in New York, Disney and Pepsi would have no time to create a showpiece structure, as this attraction was a late addition. Within weeks of agreeing to the project, the Disney-Pepsi team had signed off on blueprints for a simple L-shaped show building, what one designer referred to as a corrugated barn. The location for the little boat ride was also at the back end of the fair, far from the subway entrance and parking lots. For years, Walt had believed that guests in amusement parks were attracted by tall visual marquees rather than signs containing text. He had implemented this concept with success at Disneyland. The castle was a visual marquee, enticing guests down Main Street. The enormous Moonliner rocket was a visual marquee to entice guests into Tomorrowland, and so on. Walt believed that to effectively direct pedestrian traffic to the far end of the fair, to literally a plot right next to the elevated expressway, he would need an enormous visual marquee, what is sometimes called a visual magnet, to lure guests to the Children of the World building. Walt initially handed off design work for this visual marquee to Herb Ryman, who had contributed to Disneyland's castle. But Ryman had trouble framing the idea for this ride into a large design. Walt wanted something whimsical to suggest the play of children, but Ryman specialized in realistic designs with notes of historical and cultural accuracy. "I didn't do very well with that," Ryman said. My ideas didn't seem to mean very much. After reviewing Ryman's concepts, Walt passed the project to Disney artist Rolly Crump, who agreed to develop a visual marquee in addition to his other work for the attraction. For years, Rolly had been interested in sculpture that moved, specifically intricate mobiles. In his spare time, he had built whimsical creations and even showed them as part of the studio library's rotating art exhibitions. In ways, movement in art was a common theme among Disney animators. Art school and arts communities tended to hardwire individuals to look for unique ways of expressing a personal vision, one that was often tied to experience. A traditional painter or sculptor might look to express personality, narrative, and emotion through a robust still life. Animators such as Ward Kimball and Rolly Crump, however, sought to incorporate their knowledge of movement into traditional art forms such as painting, sculpture, and craft collage. Walt wanted something that was playful, Crump explained. The building at the fair was kind of ugly too, so the tower became the marquee, and it had a childlike tinker toy approach. Like many of Crump's previous sculptures, the model was a playful arrangement of moving parts. By gesturing toward toy imagery, specifically tinker toys and carousel animals, the tower embraced the whimsy of childhood and the innocence of youth, striking notes similar to those Walt wanted inside the ride. This structure, created so far only in miniature, would eventually be called the Tower of the Four Winds, a giant sculpture that would eventually rise up at the edge of the fair, a set of poles supporting colorful shapes that moved with the wind. It was an invitation of pure whimsy, inviting guests into a ride, where a political message of cultural equality would be offered through the voices of children, an attraction that was arranged with rich colors and music that would stand in sharp contrast to the demonstrations and protests about race and class then exploding elsewhere in New York and around the country. The elevation of Rolly Crump to the designer of the visual marquee shifted the professional relationship between Mary and Rolly. Even if the main attraction was technically a representation of Mary's artistic sensibilities, with Rolly's designs defining the outdoor tower, the two of them now were a little closer to partners in design, rather than a director and an artist, though Rolly continued to look at Mary with admiration. During these weeks, they grew close. They went to lunch together and had drinks after work. As Rolly later explained, he had initially expected Mary to be more self-aware, more focused on her own accomplishments. But instead, she was a soft-spoken person who worked hard to please Walt. "Oh, Mary never talked about her work," Rolly said. "Shy about her work, no ego." Mary and Rolly spent long days together discussing the attraction and how it should be designed, staged, and finished. Mary smoked a bit, Rolly added. She always had to take a smoking break. She would go out back and place a cigarette in a long holder before lighting it, which made smoking appear elegant. We'd have a cup of coffee, and there was a bench outside the soundstage, and we'd sit there and just talk in the afternoons. During these conversations, the image Mary presented of her life back home was almost surely partially invented or embellished, perhaps out of embarrassment or out of a wish that her real life resembled the drawings of happy children she made for Disney. Basically, Crump explained, she was telling me about her family, her boys, their beautiful home, her husband, Lee, back in Great Neck, Long Island. The way she talked about her family, she said, "We go sailing, go out to the bay, take a barbecue, take some wine, then I'll dive overboard, and Lee will throw out a tube and pull me along." These were similar to stories one might find in her Little Golden Books, where a sense of warmth surrounded the central family. But even then, Rolly could hear something unusual in her tone, something that lacked the complexity of honest life. The way she described her life was like a little girl talking, he noted. Initially, Rowley didn't know what to make of these family stories, so he put these conversations into a familiar context. At times, Walt could also express a childlike wonder about family or his past. He figured that Mary, being only a decade younger than Walt, might have this same quality, which could be one reason why Walt liked her so much. Beyond that, though, Rowley didn't dwell on it. For the most part, he was still in awe of her design ability, the way her work perfectly captured the beauty of childhood. I'd never seen anything as powerful as her work, as what she did for this ride. She just whipped this stuff out. If Rowley or anyone else on Mary's design team had any questions as to what her home life was actually like, these questions were soon to be answered when Lee, as promised, accompanied Mary on a trip to California. Lee flew out a few times, Crump recalled. From the start, Rowley could see that Lee appeared somewhat jealous of Mary, though not about her ability, or at least this was how Rowley read the situation, rather of how Mary had Walt's full attention. At one point, while reviewing stage elements for the attraction in earshot of Walt, Lee muttered, "Well, I could have done this. This is what I do, too." Watching Mary, Rowley could see now why she chose to handle the problems at home quietly, that something in her signaled that the best way to deal with this situation was to ignore it. This, Rowley believed, was the real Mary, a person moving through a difficult marriage. In Rowley's estimation, Lee needed to be recognized as an artist, not as a businessman. Lee was jealous of her because of Walt, Crump explained, 'cause she was a favorite of Walt's. He didn't pay attention to Lee like he did Mary. Mary grew within the company and Lee was just another ex-animator. Another time while Rowley was with Mary, Lee, and Walt, he noticed a stiffness in Lee's movements, as though he was going through the motions of being charming, but without much genuine emotion behind it. You could just see the body language on Lee, Rowley said, that he was sort of furious inside, 'cause it wasn't him that was asked by Walt to come out and help. With this, Rowley understood Mary from a new vantage point. He could see what her work at Disney meant to her. WED and the studio together was a place where she felt important, where her work was valued, and where she could be around like-minded artists. As long as she was with Disney people, Rowley concluded, then there was a connect. He also understood that Mary had a different personality, hiding some of her emotions and ambitions to keep peace between Lee and herself. It was around this time that Mary's friends noticed that she was drinking a bit more. Mary was part of a group of artists who went out to lunch every day, where they talked for an hour or two and had 2 or 3 martinis. Among them were key Disney artists such as Milt Kahl and Mark Davis. But no one saw Mary tipsy. With a few midday drinks, she could carry herself as well as the men. She didn't drink that much, Alice Davis explained. I never saw her drunk. The drinks didn't affect her work, just as they didn't affect the work of many male artists. She would drink with the other Disney artists, never to the point where it interfered with her work, but the drinking was noticeable now. Mary could sit down and have 3 martinis, Rowley said. You'd think, well, maybe she had 1 or 2. She was able to hold her alcohol very well. Joyce Carlson, another key artist on the project, made note of this. We'd go out for lunch every day and have martinis. Mary Blair would have 2 or 3. It was a place called Checks Cashed. There was sawdust on the floor. We played pool there. The hamburgers were 40 cents, so we'd order a hamburger and a martini. Every day we'd go in there and have martinis, but we still got our job done. In all of this, something was beginning to change for Mary, something she'd tried to push away for years. There was her art, which was often focused either on a visual exploration of shapes, the presentation of unique color combinations, or the wonders of childhood expressed through stylized figures. There were her boys. Some of her best moments were with them, but also her boys were no longer young and beginning to have lives of their own. There was Lee, who in his soul was an artist, but in life was an unhappy business owner and a frustrated husband. And then there was the world around her, a world where riots broke out as people demanded equal rights for all, regardless of gender or race, a world of growing political factions, also a world where these troubles played out each night on the evening news. Then, on the other side of the equation, there was the studio and WED, places where many of Mary's friends worked. There was a sense of artistic familiarity she found in California, and there was Walt and his belief that an amusement park boat ride might, in some small way, promote the idea of peace and understanding for a cosmopolitan audience that was often focused on politics, financial issues, national media programs, and big business. Mixed into many of these elements were a set of tensions that Mary tried to manage, tensions unlike those faced by her small-town parents, her father now deceased and her mother living up north. But this was the emotional life that Mary experienced while developing show areas for this boat ride, trying to navigate the complex worlds she knew in New York and Los Angeles, while living inside of a marriage that, at least to others, appeared to be on the verge of collapse. I'll be back next week with a new episode. But also, before I go today, let me point you to the ABC special on Disneyland's 70th that aired last week on network TV and is now streaming on Disney Plus and Hulu. I think they did a fabulous job arranging the story of Disneyland for its 70th year anniversary. I had a very small part in this, and I think the finished show, which I saw for the first time this past week, is well worth checking out. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.